SITREP World Briefing for June 17, 2026. The FBI said it had foiled an alleged plot to attack a UFC event at the White House in Washington that authorities believed would be attended by President Donald Trump. Newly unsealed court filings described a plan involving snipers and explosive drones, and U.S. authorities said 5 men had been charged in connection with the case. The alleged target was an event at the seat of the American presidency, giving the case national security implications. According to the court filings cited by federal investigators, the alleged conspiracy centered on combining remote aerial attacks with sniper fire, a mix that would have complicated any response by the Secret Service, the FBI, and Washington area police agencies. The charges against the 5 men move the case from an intelligence disruption into the federal court system, where prosecutors will have to show that the alleged preparations amounted to a prosecutable attack plot. The case highlights a broader challenge confronting U.S. domestic security agencies. Low-cost drones have become easier to acquire, easier to modify, and harder to defend against when paired with a coordinated ground assault. The FBI signaled that investigators viewed the threat as more than a generic anti-government grievance. Iran and the United States reached an agreement tied to the war surrounding Iran. The full contents of the agreement were not publicly clear on June 17th, but the deal was important enough that military and political actors elsewhere in the region were openly waiting for details before judging its effect. For Iran's leadership, the immediate task was to frame the outcome as proof that pressure from war had not forced capitulation. For ordinary Iranians, the more urgent question was whether the agreement would reduce economic pain and lower the risk of another round of fighting. The uncertainty around the agreement was visible beyond Iran's borders. In South Lebanon, on June 17th, Israeli strikes continued. The absence of public detail on the U.S.-Iran deal left other parties to calculate whether military operations would truly pause or merely be repositioned. That ambiguity matters because Iran's regional strategy has long been tied to allied armed movements and pressure points outside its own territory. Any deal with Washington can affect not only Tehran's security outlook, but also Israeli decision-making, Lebanese stability, and the pace of escalation across the Middle East. Inside Iran, the political selling of the agreement reflects a familiar divide between state messaging and household experience. Officials can describe a bargain with Washington as strategic success, but the public measure of success is usually more tangible. Whether prices fall, whether shortages ease, and whether families believe the danger of wider war has receded. In a country where sanctions, conflict risk, and currency weakness have shaped daily life for years, even a limited understanding with the United States can be judged less by ceremony in Tehran than by whether it delivers relief and prevents another destabilizing military confrontation. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres spent the day in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, on Tuesday in a visit aimed at focusing international attention on a humanitarian emergency that has deepened as armed gangs expand their control in and around the capital. His first stop was the headquarters of a new gang suppression force whose deployment the United Nations authorized last year. The visit came as the United Nations and other international actors confront a sharp deterioration in conditions across Haiti, where gang violence has driven displacement on an enormous scale. More than 1 in 10 Haitians have been forced from their homes, and the number of displaced people has reached about 1.5 million, according to figures cited around Guterres' trip. By traveling to Port-au-Prince at this moment, the UN chief sought to connect the coming security deployment with the broader need to protect civilians, restore access to neighborhoods cut off by armed groups, and shore up humanitarian relief in a country where state institutions have been battered for years. The planned force was approved by the UN Security Council in September, and Guterres' visit ahead of its new deployment signaled a push to show momentum after months in which gangs tightened their grip, commerce was disrupted, and entire communities were uprooted. For the UN, the challenge is not only to back a security operation, but also to prevent further institutional breakdown in the Caribbean nation's capital, where the success or failure of any deployment will shape whether aid can move, schools can reopen, and the government can reclaim basic authority. Leaders of the Group of Seven met in Evian, France, for a summit dominated by talks on Ukraine, Iran, and the challenge of keeping U.S. President Donald Trump aligned with the other major industrial democracies. As discussions moved through a full day of meetings, French President Emmanuel Macron, as host, faced the task of steering deliberations on how much pressure to place on Russia, while also managing transatlantic friction that has hovered over the gathering. The agenda showed the G7 trying to remain a strategic forum on war and nuclear risk. By Wednesday, the summit's final day had shifted heavily toward artificial intelligence, social media, and what French officials framed as tech sovereignty. G7 members discussed the security risks posed by AI, while leaders were also scheduled to meet executives from OpenAI, Anthropic, and France's Mistral over lunch. The debate reflected a broader contest over who sets standards for powerful digital tools, how democratic governments protect minors online, and whether Europe can reduce its dependence on foreign platforms. Macron was due to cap the summit by hosting Trump at Versailles, giving the closing hours a bilateral dimension alongside the formal G7 agenda. Inflation in the United Kingdom remained steady on 2026 S17, as the Office for National Statistics said slower increases in food prices balanced out higher petrol costs. The latest data kept price growth above the Bank of England's 2% target, with meat, dairy, and vegetables among the categories where food inflation eased, while fuel costs added pressure for households and policymakers in London and across the country. The figures matter because the Bank of England has been trying to return inflation to its 2% goal after several years in which British households faced sharp increases in essentials, including groceries, energy, and transportation. The ONS update suggested that some pressure in supermarket prices is easing, but it also showed how quickly gains can be offset when petrol becomes more expensive, leaving the central bank with a challenging policy backdrop as it weighs borrowing costs and the risk of renewed price shocks. The outlook is also being shaped by external energy risks, with the war in Iran expected to push UK inflation further above target if higher oil prices feed through more broadly into fuel, transport, and business costs. For ministers in the United Kingdom and for officials at the Bank of England, that means the June reading offered limited reassurance. Food price increases slowed, but the persistence of fuel-driven pressure showed how vulnerable the inflation path remains to events beyond Britain's borders. The United States and Iran did not put their proposed peace agreement into effect on June 17th, but officials and state-linked media reports pointed to a framework whose terms were beginning to emerge ahead of a planned signing ceremony on June 19th. The reported package includes a $300 billion reconstruction fund backed by Gulf states, a waiver of sanctions on Iranian oil exports, and a 60-day extension of the ceasefire to allow further talks on Iran's nuclear program. Those measures matter because they would reshape energy flows through the Persian Gulf, where Iranian exports have faced direct U.S. pressure since the naval blockade began on April 13th. Iranian oil tankers were reported moving past the U.S. blockade before the formal ceremony, yet the available accounts indicate that the blockade itself has not been fully lifted and that the Strait of Hormuz will not be opened under the agreement until the signing takes place. That distinction is central for oil markets, insurers, shippers, and Gulf producers, because a signed accord would be the step that converts political promises into operational changes for port access, naval enforcement, and sanctions compliance. Until then, the agreement remains prospective rather than implemented, while commercial actors position for a possible resumption of larger Iranian crude exports. If the memorandum is signed as scheduled on Friday, it would mark a significant shift in a waterway that carries a large share of the world's seaborne oil trade and links Iranian terminals to customers in Asia and beyond. The April 13 blockade targeted vessels entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas, making the prospective sanctions waiver especially important for traders, refiners, and Gulf governments that have a direct stake in stable passage through the Persian Gulf. The 60-day ceasefire extension would also buy Washington and Tehran time to test whether de-escalation at sea can be sustained while negotiators turn to the more difficult nuclear file. Sources and the full written briefing are available at sitrepbrief.com.